Story number 1. Back in 2014, something happened in the city of Ibadan, Nigeria, that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It's one of those real-life horror stories where the deeper you dig, the more disturbing it becomes. It all started with the disappearance of a local taxi driver, a regular guy just trying to make a living. He didn't come home one night, and his family knew right away something was wrong. Days passed, and there was still no word from him. The police weren't exactly rushing to help, so his friends decided to take matters into their own hands. They put together a search party and started looking for him along the routes he was known to drive. They checked all the obvious spots, major roads, nearby villages, but it was like he had vanished into thin air. Someone suggested that they should try looking around the Soka forest on the outskirts of town. Now that was a place no one went unless they had to. The locals knew better. There were always rumors about strange things happening there. People disappearing, weird noises at night, flickering lights deep within the trees. The kind of place you avoid because you just know something isn't right. But the taxi driver's friends were desperate. If their friend was out there, they had to find him. So they headed into the forest. At first, it was just overgrown paths and the usual eerie quiet you'd expect in a remote place. But then they stumbled across something they could never have imagined. A decaying old building hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't clear what the place had been, maybe an old school or a factory, but it was obvious that whatever it used to be, it had become something much darker. When they went inside, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. The walls were lined with rusted chains, mattresses stained with filth and blood were strewn across the floor, and piles of dirty clothes lay everywhere. But that wasn't the worst part. Scattered among the debris were human bones, rotting corpses, and half-eaten remains. Some skulls still had bits of hair clinging to them, as if whoever had left them there hadn't cared if they were ever discovered. The stench of death was overwhelming, and then they found the survivors. There were 8 of them, barely alive, chained to walls or locked inside cages. These people were little more than skeletons, starved, beaten, and broken. Some of them were incoherent, mumbling words that made no sense, while others stared blankly, as if whatever they had endured had drained the life out of them. They had been left to die in that hellhole, forgotten by the world. When the search party brought the survivors back to town, the news spread like wildfire. Everyone wanted to know who was responsible. How could a place like this exist so close to their city without anyone knowing? Theories started flying. Some people thought it was a human trafficking ring, while others were convinced it was a ritualistic site. In Nigeria, stories about ritual killings aren't uncommon, especially when it involves the powerful or wealthy. Fingers were pointed at local politicians and known ritualists, but no arrests were ever made. Whoever had been running that place had vanished without a trace, leaving only questions behind. And here's where the story gets even weirder. The taxi driver? The whole reason they found that building in the first place? He was never found. They searched the building top to bottom, checked the bodies and bones, but there was no sign of him. Not among the survivors, not among the dead. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. Even now, no one knows what happened to him. Did he stumble upon something he wasn't supposed to see? Did the people running that place take him somewhere else, knowing a search party would follow? Or was his disappearance connected to something even darker that we'll never understand? What really gets to me about this story is that it didn't end with the discovery of the building. The survivors were rescued, but the building itself wasn't destroyed. It's still out there, hidden deep in the woods, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Locals say that if you go too close to the area, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. Some say they hear whispers in the trees at night, or catch glimpses of strange lights flickering between the branches. I try to wrap my head around what happened in that forest. Who built that place? How many people had suffered there before it was found? And what kind of people could do something so monstrous and then just vanish without a trace? To this day, it remains a mystery. Story number 2. This one is like a true crime rabbit hole, bizarre and unsettling from the start. Zeb Quinn was just 18 when he vanished on January 2nd, 2000 in Asheville, North Carolina. He'd finished a shift at Walmart and met up with Robert Jason Owens, a co-worker, to check out a car Zeb was interested in buying. It was a pretty normal evening, at first. Surveillance footage from a gas station caught the two buying sodas around 9:15 p.m., but not long after, things started getting weird. Owens later told police that Zeb flashed his headlights at him on the road, signaling him to pull over. When Owens did, Zeb said he had just received a page and needed to make a phone call. He used a payphone nearby, and when he returned, he was frantic, like something had seriously spooked him. Zeb apologized, saying something had come up and that he had to cancel their plans. In his hurry, Zeb accidentally rear-ended Owens' truck before speeding off into the night, never to be seen again. That's the last confirmed sighting of Zeb Quinn. What happened next only added more layers to the mystery. 2 days after Zeb's disappearance, someone called his Walmart employer pretending to be Zeb, saying he was too sick to come to work, but the voice didn't sound right, and Walmart traced the call back to the Volvo plant where Owens worked. Owens later admitted to making the call, but claimed Zeb had asked him to. It was an odd, suspicious move, but there wasn't much police could do with just that. Then on January 16th, 2 weeks after Zeb vanished, his car turned up in a parking lot outside a barbecue restaurant near the hospital where his mother worked. And this is where things get really weird. The headlights of Zeb's Mazda were still on, and someone had drawn a pair of lips and an exclamation mark on the back window using pink lipstick. Inside the car, police found random items that only deepened the mystery: a live Labrador mixed puppy, several drink bottles, a jacket that didn't belong to Zeb, and a plastic hotel keycard. Investigators tried to trace the keycard to a specific hotel but came up empty-handed. Witnesses later reported seeing the car being driven downtown, and when police created a sketch based on the descriptions, it looked eerily similar to Misty Taylor, a woman Zeb had been romantically interested in. But Misty had a boyfriend named Wesley Smith, and people said he was controlling and abusive. One of those guys who doesn't take rejection well. There were rumors that Wesley had threatened Zeb to stay away from Misty, though nothing was ever proven. For years, the case went cold. No body was found, no new leads emerged, and every theory ended in a dead end. It was like Zeb had been swallowed by the night. Owens' story didn't add up, but without solid evidence, police couldn't charge him with anything. Zeb's family was left without answers, haunted by the bizarre details surrounding his disappearance. Why was there a puppy in his car? What was the meaning of the lipstick message on the window? And why did Owens lie about the phone call? None of it made sense. The case stayed cold for 15 years until 2015, when Robert Jason Owens was arrested for an unrelated crime that shook the Asheville community. In 2015, Owens was arrested for the murder of Christy Schoen Codd, a former contestant on Food Network Star, along with her husband J.T. Codd and their unborn child. Owens claimed their deaths were accidental, but he later admitted to dismembering the couple's bodies. The gruesome nature of the crime, and Owens' apparent ease in carrying it out, gave investigators new reasons to revisit his connection to Zeb's disappearance. During a search of Owens' property, detectives found strange evidence: fragments of concrete, pieces of leather and fabric, and bags filled with a white powder that appeared to be lime or mortar mix. Materials often used to dispose of bodies. It wasn't enough to confirm Zeb had been there, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. In 2017, 17 years after Zeb disappeared, Owens was officially charged with Zeb's murder. But even that didn't answer all the questions surrounding the case. When Owens was charged with Zeb's murder, he made a startling claim. According to Owens, his uncle, who had since passed away, was the real killer. Owens said his uncle had been hired by Wesley Smith, Misty Taylor's jealous boyfriend, to eliminate Zeb. Owens claimed his uncle dismembered Zeb's body, burned the remains, and scattered the ashes in the Bent Creek Experimental Forest, a vast and dense area outside Asheville. Even with this confession, police could never recover Zeb's remains. The forest was too large, and whatever evidence might have been there had long since disappeared. Owens' story raised more questions than it answered. If his uncle had killed Zeb, why did Owens make that strange phone call to Walmart? And what was the meaning behind the lipstick message on the car? The whole thing felt like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. Despite Owens' arrest and confession, Zeb Quinn's disappearance remains a mystery. There are too many loose ends, too many strange details that don't fit. Why was the puppy left in Zeb's car? Who drew the lipstick symbols on the window? And what were they supposed to mean? If Misty Taylor or her boyfriend were involved, why wasn't any solid evidence ever found linking them to the crime? Owens is now serving a lengthy prison sentence for the Cod murders, but the truth about what happened to Zeb might never come to light. It's possible Owens knows more than he's saying, or that someone else involved has managed to stay under the radar all these years. Story number 3. So back in 2010, this guy named Ben McDaniel goes missing at Vortex Spring, Florida. If you've never been, Vortex is a pretty popular dive site, but not exactly for beginners. It's got a cave system that's no joke. I mean, there's a sign right outside the entrance to the cave that says, "Nothing in this cave is worth dying for." That should tell you everything. Now here's the deal. Ben wasn't cave certified. This wasn't just a technicality. Diving caves without certification is like walking into a lion's den with raw steaks taped to your body. You just don't do it. But Ben? He was obsessed. People saw him hanging around the place a lot, always diving alone, always pushing his luck. He was going through some stuff too. His brother had died recently, his marriage fell apart, his business went belly up, and he owed the IRS a ton of money. So yeah, it wasn't hard to guess that diving was his escape. On August 18th, Ben shows up at Vortex for another dive. The two guys working there that night, Eduardo Turan and Chuck Cronin, they knew Ben pretty well. They'd seen him poking around the gate to the cave, and even though Ben didn't have the credentials to go past it, they figured, what's the harm? So they let him through. That was the last time anyone saw him. Now here's where things get weird. And trust me, I've heard some strange stories, but this one's on another level. Ben didn't resurface. Days passed, and no one thought much of it at first because his truck was still parked outside like always. But after 2 days, people started realizing something was seriously off. They searched the caves with some of the best divers out there. I'm talking about guys who've been into spaces so tight you can't even move your head left or right without scraping the rock. But no sign of Ben. All they found were 2 decompression tanks near the cave entrance, and they weren't even filled with a mixed gas. You know, the kind of stuff you'd expect for a serious dive. Nope, just regular air, which was weird as hell. The deeper the divers went, the less sense the whole thing made. There weren't any marks on the limestone walls, no scrapes from tanks or helmets, and no sign of scavengers, which you'd expect if there was a body. It was like Ben had vanished into thin air. Here's the thing, though. This isn't just about a diver getting lost. There are so many loose ends that it feels like there's something darker going on. One theory is that Ben faked his own death. I mean, he had a ton of debt and personal issues. It's not impossible. Maybe he saw an out and took it, disappearing into some new life under a different name. But that theory doesn't sit well with his parents. They swear he wouldn't put them through that, not after what they went through with his brother's death. There's also talk that Ben might have been killed, maybe by someone at the dive shop. And here's where it gets even creepier. The owner of Vortex Spring, Lowell Kelly, died under really suspicious circumstances about a year after Ben went missing. Kelly was known to be a little off. Once, he beat an employee with a bat and left the poor guy out in the woods. The guy survived, but was so freaked out he packed up his family and skipped town. And get this, when Kelly died, he had blunt force trauma to his head. But the cops never ruled it a homicide, just nothing. Same as Ben, no answers, no closure. People have searched that cave for years, and some of the divers who went in looking for Ben said the same thing. He's not in there. They were so sure that some divers, like Ed Sorensen, even refused to go back in because, in their words, if Ben's not in the cave, then he's nowhere. It doesn't help that one of the guys searching for Ben, Larry Higginbotham, died during a dive a couple of years later. After that, the $30,000 reward Ben's family put up for information was quietly pulled, and the case just faded away. The whole thing leaves you with more questions than answers. If Ben didn't drown in that cave, then where the hell did he go? And if he was murdered, why wasn't there more evidence? Or is it really possible that he pulled off a disappearing act and is sipping margaritas on a beach in Mexico right now? No one knows. And honestly, with how deep this rabbit hole goes, I'm not sure anyone ever will. Story number 4. The yogurt shop murders is one of those cases where the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. It happened on December 6th, 1991, in Austin, Texas. 4 girls, Jennifer Harbison, 17, her younger sister Sarah Harbison, 15, their friend Eliza Thomas, 17, and Amy Ayers, 13, were hanging out at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop that night. Jennifer and Eliza were working the evening shift, and Sarah and Amy were there waiting for a ride home. Sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., someone entered the shop. Whether it was one person or more, no one knows. What we do know is horrifying. The girls were tied up using their own clothing, shot execution style in the head, and the killers set the shop on fire before fleeing. The fire burned through most of the evidence, leaving behind only traces of the nightmare. When police arrived, the scene was chaos. Everything had been soaked with water from the fire hoses, which made gathering forensic evidence almost impossible. But even in the destruction, what was left showed just how brutal this crime was. 3 of the girls were found in the back room, their bodies piled together, while Amy Ayers, the youngest, was found on her own, still clinging to life. She'd been shot in the head, but the bullet hadn't killed her instantly. Despite the paramedics' efforts, she didn't survive. From the beginning, the case was a mess. The police had no leads, no witnesses, and no clear motive. Hundreds of people were interviewed, and more than 50 people confessed to the crime at one point or another. But none of those confessions matched the evidence. Those were either false or coerced. As the investigation dragged on, the people of Austin grew terrified. A crime this brutal, and no one was any closer to figuring out who did it. Then in 1999, 8 years after the murders, police made arrests. 4 men, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Morris Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn, were taken into custody. At the time of the murders, they were teenagers. Police believed they'd committed the crime together, but the evidence? It was flimsy at best. Springsteen and Scott confessed after hours of intense interrogation. But here's the thing. Their confessions were riddled with inconsistencies. They struggled to recall basic details about the crime, and it seemed like the investigators had fed them answers. One confession stands out as particularly troubling. When Michael Scott was asked how the girls were tied up, he guessed things like Venetian blinds or napkins. He only got the right answer, using the girls' clothing, after detectives repeatedly pushed him. It was clear these confessions weren't reliable. Despite the shaky evidence, Springsteen and Scott went to trial. In 2001, Springsteen was sentenced to death, and a year later, Scott got life in prison. But the other 2, Pierce and Wellborn, never even made it to trial. The charges against them were dropped for lack of evidence. It could have ended there. Case closed. But in 2009, the convictions were overturned. Both men had their confessions used against each other in court, which violated their constitutional right to cross-examine witnesses. Even worse, new DNA testing on a sample found at the scene didn't match any of the 4 men. Just like that, the state's case fell apart, and Springsteen and Scott were released from prison. They had spent nearly a decade behind bars for a crime they might not have committed, and that's where things get really unsettling. If it wasn't them, who did it? Why was there unknown DNA at the scene? And how did the police get the confession so wrong? Some people still think those 4 guys were involved somehow, but with no physical evidence linking them to the crime, there's no way to know for sure. Adding to the frustration, there hasn't been any major movement in the case since the convictions were overturned. The investigation is technically still open, but it's considered a cold case at this point. New detectives come in, review the old files, but nothing ever sticks. And here's the kicker. This case isn't just about catching the killers. It's also a story about how pressure to solve a high-profile crime can lead to serious mistakes. Springsteen and Scott weren't saints, but the way their confessions were coerced raises real questions about how the case was handled. To this day, the real killers might still be out there, and the families of those girls are left without answers. Every time I hear about this case, I think about the fire, the way the killers used it to destroy evidence and cover their tracks. It's almost like the fire wasn't just meant to hide the crime, but to bury the truth along with it. Story number 5. In 1922, this whole family, 6 people, got murdered on their own farm called Hinterkaifeck in a remote area of Bavaria, Germany. It was Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, 2 grandkids, and a maid who just started working there. What makes this story so damn creepy is not just the murders, but all the weird stuff that happened around it. Even 100 years later, nobody knows what really went down. Here's how it started. Andreas Gruber found these weird footprints in the snow around the farm. The tracks led to the house, but not away from it. He heard noises from the attic too, but when he went to check, he didn't find anyone there. Now, most people would call the cops or at least be on edge, but not Andreas. He just shrugged it off like, yeah, whatever. Even their previous maid had quit because she swore the place was haunted. You'd think that'd be a red flag, right? Nope. He just hired a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, and kept it moving. So on March 31st, 1922, something really messed up happened. The family was lured into the barn, probably one by one. That's where they were killed with a mattock, a type of pickaxe. And it wasn't a quick, clean thing either. The blows were brutal. Cecilia Jr., the 7-year-old granddaughter, didn't even die right away. She was alive long enough to pull out clumps of her own hair in fear. I can't imagine how horrifying that must have been. The killer didn't stop there. He went into the house and killed the maid and baby Joseph too. Here's where it gets even weirder. After killing 6 people, whoever did it just stayed. They lived in the house for a couple of days. Neighbors saw smoke coming from the chimney. The animals were fed. The cows were milked. Even some food was eaten. This person or people were just hanging out there, surrounded by the bodies like it was no big deal. The bodies weren't found until 4 days later when a neighbor, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, went to check on the family after they didn't show up at church. Now, Lawrence is one of the strangest parts of this whole case. He used to be involved with Victoria, the daughter, and there's even a chance he was the father of baby Joseph. When he and a couple of other guys got to the farm, Lorenz had a key to the house. That's already a little suspicious. He also disturbed the bodies in the barn, supposedly trying to find his son, though that doesn't really add up. His behavior was so weird that people started wondering if he was involved. Then there's this insane theory about Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel. Supposedly, he died in World War I, but they never found his body. Some folks think he faked his death, came back years later, found out about the incest between Andreas and Victoria, and killed the whole family in a fit of rage. Yeah, it sounds wild, but in a case like this, even the most far-fetched theories feel possible. The cops interviewed a bunch of people, but they never got anywhere. And on top of that, the investigation was a mess from the start. When people discovered the bodies, they just walked through the house, ate food, moved things around. It was like a circus. Later, the skulls of the victims were sent to Munich for further examination. But get this, the skulls were lost during World War II. It's like every possible thing that could go wrong with this case did go wrong. Even now, no one knows who did it or why. Theories point to everyone from neighbors to wandering vagrants to secret lovers, but nothing sticks. The most unnerving part? There were all these little details, footsteps, missing keys, strange noises, and the family just ignored them. They didn't report anything to the police, and it cost them their lives. This case has haunted people for a century. It's not just about the murders, it's about the unknown. The idea that someone could walk onto your property, kill your family, live in your house for days, and then vanish without a trace, that kind of thing stays with you. Even after all these years, Hinterkaifeck still feels like an unsolvable puzzle, the kind that makes you look over your shoulder when you're alone at night. Story number 6. Here's a retelling of one of the creepiest unsolved mysteries I've come across, the Circleville Letters. It sounds straight out of a psychological thriller, but this really happened, and it's unsettling in ways that linger with you. The case centers on a small town in Ohio, where back in 1977, residents started receiving terrifying anonymous letters. Ones filled with strange, personal details about their private lives. And for some people, these letters were more than just creepy. They came with life-threatening consequences. The first major target of the letters was a woman named Mary Gillespie, a local school bus driver. Out of nowhere, she received an anonymous letter accusing her of having an affair with Gordon Massey, the school superintendent. Now, Mary denied the affair, but whoever sent the letter seemed convinced she was guilty. The letters didn't stop, and they started targeting Mary's husband, Ron Gillespie, too. One letter told him that if he didn't stop his wife's supposed affair, he would be in serious danger. At this point, things escalated quickly. The couple tried to keep the letters to themselves, hoping they'd stop. But the letters didn't just stop. Whoever was writing them doubled down. They were coming more frequently, becoming more threatening, and worse, someone started posting signs along Mary's bus route, accusing her of all kinds of things. One of these signs even had a booby trap rigged to it, a loaded pistol hidden behind it, set to fire if someone tampered with it. Luckily, the trap malfunctioned, but it proved just how dangerous the situation had become. Meanwhile, the harassment was taking its toll on Ron. On one particular day, Ron received a strange phone call. No one knows for sure what was said, but it was enough to make him leave his house in a hurry. He jumped into his pickup truck, seemingly determined to confront whoever was harassing his family. Just hours later, Ron's truck was found crashed into a tree. He was dead. Initially, police believed the crash was an accident, possibly caused by Ron's drinking. But things didn't add up. Ron had a revolver on him, and one shot had been fired from it. To this day, no one knows who or what he was aiming at before the crash. The fact that Ron was in a state of panic when he left the house only adds to the eerie mystery. After Ron's death, the letters intensified. Whoever the writer was, they didn't let up, not even for a second. Mary became the primary target again, with more signs, more letters, and more terrifying threats appearing along her bus route. It was relentless, and the police were stumped. It seemed like the writer knew everything about Mary and her family, including things that weren't public knowledge. The level of surveillance was terrifying. Someone was watching them at all times, and the Gillespies had no way to figure out who it was. Then in 1983, authorities finally made an arrest. The suspect was a man named Paul Freshour, Mary's brother-in-law. Freshour's estranged wife had suggested to police that he might be responsible for the letters. They searched his home and found evidence linking him to the booby trap that had been left on Mary's bus route. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder. And even though there was no direct evidence tying him to the letters, Paul was convicted and sentenced to prison. Here's where things get even stranger. The letters didn't stop. Even while Paul Freshour was locked up in prison, the letters continued to pour into the mailboxes of Circleville residents. Paul maintained his innocence the entire time, insisting he had nothing to do with the letters. And yet, they just kept coming. Even prison officials were baffled. How could Paul be sending letters from behind bars? They put him in solitary confinement at one point, with no access to writing materials, and still the letters showed up. Paul was released from prison in 1994 after serving 10 years, but the damage had already been done. The town was left haunted by years of harassment and unanswered questions. Mary Gillespie always maintained that Paul wasn't the writer. She believed someone else had been targeting her family for reasons she couldn't explain. But to this day, the true identity of the Circleville letter writer has never been confirmed. In 2021, a forensics expert came forward saying the police were right all along. Paul Freshour was the writer. The expert claimed that the handwriting samples matched. But here's the kicker. If Paul was the mastermind, how the hell were letters still being sent while he was locked up? That's the question nobody's been able to answer. And frankly, it leaves the whole case in this liminal space, somewhere between solved and unsolved. The Circleville Letters case is one of those mysteries that keeps you up at night. It's not just about the crime itself. It's the idea that someone, for no clear reason, could infiltrate your life, know your secrets, and destroy your peace without ever getting caught. Whether it was Paul Freshour or someone else entirely, the truth is still out there, buried somewhere in the endless pile of anonymous letters. And it's the kind of story that makes you think twice about checking your mailbox. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.